Hot seat number 3, Q&A, Pat and Eric. Welcome everyone to Poly Pat. We're back on the hot seat, Pat.
Always a pleasure, my friend.
I love these episodes, but man, it's kind of nerve-wracking because I never know what you're going to ask, and hopefully we provide good answers to each other. But we'll see what happens.
It's fun. Yeah, I don't know. We definitely don't lob each other softballs,
Right.
which is good. But then again, I'm never afraid to punt. If I don't know, you will find out quickly.
Okay, cool.
Uh-huh.
Well, hey, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
Yeah, you know what? I'll throw one your way first.
Okay.
So here's a question that I was going to take on my podcast, but I would like your opinion on it.
Okay.
And I guess this is kind of a softball, but it's more of a practical consideration, or I think it will be for a lot of people. And that is, what do you think arguments for the existence of God, what role do you think arguments for the existence of God actually play? The person who originally wrote this said, when I look around on the internet, bad metric, I know, they often don't seem to convince skeptics, even if I personally think some of them should.
Wow. Well, different personalities and different people kind of jive with different things. So like some people will come into the Catholic Church more from an emotional or life experience way of actually experiencing God in some way. Or it may be, an emotional pull. Other people are more intellectual, geared more towards that, and they want arguments. They want proof. I think for arguments for God's existence, I think it's mainly helpful for people that are already believing in God, actually, to strengthen our own faith using reason. So it bolsters our faith. It's a bulwark for faith. And it can be helpful to plant seeds in skeptics. So it can be helpful to demonstrate. And if we can demonstrate on an intellectually sound argument for God's existence, then that could place a seed of doubt in an atheist mind that I think could germinate over time. And so even if we don't see the effect or the fruit of the argument right away, we might see it over time. It might be one of the many things that draws someone in. So for me personally, I have always really believed in God since growing up. I was baptized in first grade. I've never even struggled with believing in God's existence. But for me, I enjoy hearing these arguments for God's existence because it bolsters my faith. And especially if an atheist comes on the scene and proposes something that kind of could rattle my faith, I go back to these arguments and I get strengthened again and be like, no, that doesn't make sense for this, this, and this. So that would be my answer. It definitely bolsters our faith, and it can provide seeds that prepare people for faith in God later. And some people are just straight up convinced by those arguments, even if you're not, so some people that really helps. I know that was probably helpful in your story, right? Is seeing these arguments. And so different strokes for different folks, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it's am I allowed to take a whack at my own
Go
question?
for it, yes.
Yeah. Just add to what you say, which I obviously very much agree with. I think the person who wrote this question said that they think the argument should convince people, but sometimes they don't. And that is certainly true, right? And I thought a lot back on my, I hate the term journey, but I'll use it, the spiritual journey, right? And I think it's not just personality, but it's an emotional state too. When I was a skeptic, I think I was still I was a very philosophically sincere seeker, right? So I never had a deep emotional animus against religion. I would take some of the caricatured, jabs here and there, but I never had a deep resentment of religion or the idea of God or even Christianity as a whole. So I think that was important, because then when I started to encounter difficulties with the various atheistic worldview proposals, and I did encounter some arguments in natural theology for God's existence, it's, as you said, Eric, it at least planted some seeds, right? And even for me, it's not like you just see one argument and then boom, you're convinced, right? No, it's a process. It's gradual. Many for people, often many years of study, right? And obviously some arguments are better than others. So what's the practical utility, would I say? I would say planting seeds, certainly. It can build a bridge for people who are sincere seekers. It can also in a public forum, it's important when there's kind of a dialogue going on. Maybe it's you and a skeptic. Okay, maybe you're not convincing the person who's directly across the table from you, so to speak, on the other side of the computer screen, but there might be 10, 20 other people looking in at that conversation, and
Yeah.
you don't know how your arguments might affect them. And I'll tell you, it's very often, it has been very often when I'll have an exchange or an engagement, or I'll leave a comment on some website or social media thing and get into it a little bit. And again, do I always convince my interlocutor? No. But do I frequently get messages from other people who are curious or interested in what I had to say? Yes. So remember, there's often onlookers. And then certainly for people of faith, I think you're absolutely right, Eric. It does really bolster the faith. It gives a huge amount of intellectual credibility to it. I was actually just talking with a priest friend of mine, and who had a debate fairly recently. And I prepped him, I gave him some heads up, because, just like, hey, here's what's kind of in the literature lately over arguments for the existence of God and whatnot. So you might want to, keep an eye on this. And what I have realized is when it comes to certain skeptics, right? And this is something I took for granted. Is it okay if I go on for another minute or two?
Keep going. Yes.
Right. Is they're not the same kind of skeptic I was. I think I was always genuinely somebody who just wanted to understand the truth about things, the deep structure of reality. But there's a type of skeptic out there who's a more sophisticated skeptic, to be sure, but they seem more interested in kind of scouring the literature or just trying to find any old objections that they can to avoid a conclusion they don't like. And that's a very different kind of person, right? That's something that I've tried to come to appreciate more deeply. Now, it's important to be able to address those objections and be aware of that skeptic, but that is not a skeptic that I think is somebody who's going to be as easily convinced, let's say, because I think that as many of us can all be, right, priorly committed to a position that we're just not willing to budge from for any reasons. And so we can become clever, but not necessarily wise. And that's a matter of practical discernment to try and figure out, okay, what type of, skeptic or interlocutor am I dealing with here?
Mm-hmm.
And how much time should I invest in this? Should I come at this from another angle? Because if I sense that it's a skeptic of the latter sort, I'll address the objections, but I might try and get off the contentious issues and maybe try and form some common ground in another place and bring down some of the emotional barriers. So it's a difficult question. I don't have a straightforward answer to it, but those are just at least some of my initial thoughts.
That's great. And Paul, he didn't come all the time with fancy arguments, but in the power of the Holy Spirit and the power of God. But then other times he used the cultural's arguments, and like the poets and all of those things to really put forth a case for the resurrection of Christ and all of that. And so I think in the end, it all matters. And you never know, like I never know who's listening to this podcast, right? Like I have no idea who's being affected by it or not. And so just be faithful. If you feel this, the Lord pulling you to make these arguments, and if you have that gift, like you have a certain gift, of course, like please share it regardless of the effect that you see. And sometimes I think about this too, is like sometimes the things that we do we won't even see the fruit of them until maybe 150 years from now or 200 years. Like St. Louis de Montfort, like his book got rediscovered way later, but he was faithful to write it in his lifetime.
And we shouldn't forget that there are sincere skeptics who have sincere intellectual barriers, and that's why the philosophy and the apologetics is useful. And I'm sure you get it, Eric. In fact, there's a listener of this podcast, I won't name him right now, who we did a previous episode and we worked through some of the objections that they had, good, serious objections. I think we overcame them, and not too long ago, they said that they are back in camp theism now.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So those people are out there, sincere people who just have sincere intellectual objections.
Yes.
I would say you have to take them seriously. You have to show respect to that position as well. And then it's just a matter of discernment to try and figure out if that's actually a position someone is in. Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's a great question. Well, here's my question for you, Pat. What is divine simplicity And what is problematic about departing from this view?
Man.
Boom.
Yeah, so divine simplicity says whatever is in God is God, right? So
Whoa.
why, boom, that's divine simplicity, right? So whatever God's power is God's knowledge, is God's love, is God's goodness. There is no complexity in God, no parts, no metaphysical or physical complexity or parts. God is absolutely, as the name implies, simple, absolutely ontologically simple. So you're gonna have to give me more than 2 minutes to unpack this, my friend, because
Please do.
this is a big one.
This is a big one.
And I'm big on it. This is a big reason that I became Catholic, because when you're on the hunt for ultimate explanations, this is how I'll start this out, right? When you're on the hunt for ultimate explanations, there's certain aspects of reality that cry out for explanation, that cry out for an external cause of some sort. Aspects of reality such as the reduction of potency to acts, or anything that itself is composite, where the parts are logically prior to the whole. These are things that require and cry out for or point out towards some type of external explanation. For example, causes, to use a colloquial term, right? So when you're on the metaphysical hunt for ultimate explanations, what I want to say is, at the end of the day, if you follow the chain of intelligibility through, you're going to have to get to that which is absolutely ontologically simple, that which is pure actuality itself, in order to understand how there is any metaphysically composite being between act and potency. Just to give a simple example. So the famous act and potency distinction is probably the best one to start with on how you get to divine simplicity, especially in the order of existence. That certain things have actual existence, but they have it in a limited, finite way. It's bounded or delimited by a particular essence. Let's say it exists, but it doesn't have to exist, so it cries out for an explanation beyond itself. It exists in virtue of something else. It is a dependent existent. It is not a necessary existent, for example. It doesn't exist in virtue of what it is. And so, without repeating the arguments that I've written about many times and done on my podcast before in too much detail, this ultimately has to get you back to something which is pure actuality itself, that exists in virtue of itself in an unbounded, unrestricted way. And the word pure is really important, right? That it's not a composite of act and potency in any way whatsoever, that God can have no potential part, if you will, because it doesn't even make sense to say that God would have a potential part, because to have a potential part means there's some aspect or feature or dimension of you that can be brought to actuality, to actual existence, right? Well, what would actualize that? What could actualize that? And the answer is either something more fundamental would have to actualize that, in which case we're just back in the regress of causes for intelligibility, or nothing can actualize it, right? Those are the only two options. And if nothing can actualize it, then it's not a potential at all. It's literally nothing, right? A potential that can't be actualized is nothing. That was an objection somebody gave to my argument one time. Like, that's interesting, but it's just a trick of language. You're talking about literally nothing. Because somebody tried to say, as an objection to divine simplicity, well, maybe God just has a potential part that can't be actualized. I'm like, that's nothing, friend. That doesn't exist, right? You're talking about nothing, right? So what's the general point here? The general point is, when you're really doing metaphysics and serious philosophy, and you're not just doing souped up apologetics, divine simplicity is the only ultimate principled stopping point, right? That's the only place where you can get to what we might be able to call an existent that is self-explanatory. And it's self-explanatory because it lacks any of those ontological features or aspects that cry out for an external explanation. For example, reduction of potency to act, metaphysical compositeness, a distinction between essence and existence, right? There's different paths we can take to get to God's existence, but they all correspond or converge upon that which is pure actuality itself, absolute simplicity itself, no distinction between the whatness and the isness of the thing, the essence and the existence. So divine simplicity arrives from the great, is the conclusion of the great metaphysical hunt for ultimate explanations and intelligibility, right? And importantly, this is why you see it as a shared and common commitment among many of the world's greatest philosophers and metaphysicians. It's by no means just something you find in the Catholic tradition. You find it in the Jewish tradition. You find it in the Hindu tradition. You find it in the ancient Greek philosophers, for example. Plotinus is obviously and his famous the one. Right now, why is that? Why is that? Because when you reason consistently, and in metaphysical channels, that's the conclusion you're going to reach. So it's not surprising that we would see this as a shared commitment. The Catholic Church, however, just says that this is true. This is a dogma, right? So as Catholics, we are committed to this, and we would also want to argue that we see it in Scripture as well. Certainly, when we're reading Scripture with a proper metaphysical background or understanding. So to clear away a few common misconceptions, when we say that God's power is God's love, is God's goodness, this confuses people because they think we're saying that power as we know it in us is the same thing as love as we know it in us. And that's not what we're saying, right? What we're saying is something like power in us is something like knowledge in us. And there's what's known as the principle of analogy, right? That we have to constantly keep in mind. Two metaphysical tools you have to keep in mind when you're doing metaphysics, right? And especially when we start talking about God. One is that we proceed apophatically when we start to, encroach upon ultimate reality. We're really saying more about what ultimate reality is not than we often are saying about what ultimate reality is, right? God is not finite. He's not metaphysically composite, for example. He has no distinction between his essence and his existence, right? We're kind of stripping things away in the metaphysical process. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't know real positive things about God, but we often proceed apophatically. The other is, of course, the principle of analogy. God has something like power in the way that we know it, but infinitely higher, right? God has something like knowledge as we know it, but infinitely higher. And what we're really saying in divine simplicity is whatever the ontological basis of God's power is, just is whatever the ontological basis of God's knowledge is, for example. Strange? Yes. But surprising? Not really, right? If we're talking about that which is infinitely higher than us, that which is qualitatively unbounded, that which is pure actuality itself, when we're talking about God, why would we be surprised that things are a little bit strange, a little bit different? I mean, this is just a common, certainly Christian commitment that we ought not to anthropomorphize God, that whatever else God is, he's not a creature, right? So it would make sense, given that God is the ultimate creator of everything else, the unmoved mover, pure actuality, absolutely simple, that there's going to be certain things that we can conclude about God and argue philosophically that are going to seem a little bit strange. It would surprise me if that wasn't the case, right? If we were talking about God and he just seems to be like a human person, just a lot bigger and stronger and smarter. And I think this is a theological position that too many Christians unfortunately hold. That seems horribly anthropomorphic. That seems like we haven't done metaphysics, right? We've just done some type of souped up apologetic project. So why is it important to hold divine simplicity? It's important to hold divine simplicity for all the reasons that I just gave. If you want to have an ultimate source of intelligibility, a ground of all being, you're going to need divine simplicity. If you want to have God, you're going to need divine simplicity. And it's often been said by various defenders of divine simplicity, I think both Edward Fazer and David Bentley Hart, that to accept anything less than divine simplicity is to accept atheism, right? Because if you're not accepting divine simplicity and you're still positing some great, powerful being, he's still going to have those ontological categories that make him dependent, that put him in need of an external explanation. And whatever else God is, that's not it, right? So there's a lot that hinges upon divine simplicity. One is the general, ultimate, satisfying terminus of the metaphysical project, a principled stopping point in the order of both causes and intelligibility, and theism itself, I would argue, rests in divine simplicity. So sorry for taking so much time.
No, this is great.
It's an
So
important question.
how would someone like, there's a famous apologist out there, William Lane Craig, who I guess supposedly doesn't believe in divine simplicity.
Right. Yeah. He rejects it.
So surely he's heard these arguments. And so do you have any idea like why he or how he rejects it? Like how does he get around this?
There's, first off, let me say I very much appreciate Dr. Bill Craig's work. I think he's great thinker.
Mhm.
He's his work on the Kalam cosmological argument is very good, but his arguments against divine simplicity are very weak. Some of them are just sort of dismissive, hand waving. It's just unintelligible type of arguments. I forget the specific arguments that he makes in his book. Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. So I don't want to misrepresent him. But I remember being massively unimpressed by his critiques. And of course, he was one of the people I wanted to look at because he's very smart, right? But I think he would probably just not accept a number of the metaphysical principles that I would be working with in other metaphysicians that lead you to divine simplicity. Principles like the principle of proportionate causality, the analogy of being, stuff like that. Now, I would argue you need to accept those principles. You can't escape those principles. And once you have those principles, divine simplicity is the conclusion, and it's perfectly intelligible. So that's, you get this sort of these hand-waving dismissals of divine simplicity where people will say, it's unintelligible. And, Craig's also sort of in the modern analytic philosophical tradition as well, which I think has severe limits. It's got too restricted of a metaphysical toolkit, which makes certain, I would argue, Thomistic philosophical projects difficult, if not impossible, for them. The way they think about essentialism, and their use of modal essentialism versus real essentialism. So some of these topics are deep and weedy, but I would say, coming out of the analytic tradition can be a barrier to entry. I would say you need to expand your metaphysical toolkit. It's too restricted. And then maybe some other principles of causality and being he might have issues with, or if not Craig specifically, because again, I don't want to misrepresent him. I know at least other philosophers, that's where their holdups are. And then when they have, when they're not working with the same toolkit, or they're not working with a shared set of commitments, we can see why they would have issues with divine simplicity, right? So if you don't make distinction between types of properties in the way that other philosophers do, and you don't have the principle of analogy, then divine simplicity is going to seem really weird, right? Because then you are going to have to say something like you think that knowledge in us is the same thing as like power in us, and then you're going to that makes no sense. Divine simplicity can't be true, but that isn't what proponents of divine simplicity say, right? And that's why some of these other metaphysical principles that we use are so critically important in the debate, because if they get overlooked, then we're just talking past each other. So that's some of the, I think, reasons that people miss it or don't get it, because they're either working with too restricted of a metaphysical toolkit, or they're not using other, or they're not keeping in mind things like, the principle of analogy, stuff like that.
And there's so much to unpack here, but we'll move on to other questions. But just for right now, if our listeners want to go deeper in this, do you have any other podcasts or resources that you would recommend? Like, hey, I wrote on this, like, if you want to go deeper, here's something.
Yeah. Actually, a couple of things. My $1 ebook, How to Think About God, makes, I think, a pretty robust case for divine simplicity. I have multiple sub-arguments for divine simplicity in that. I also deal with some of the more serious objections to divine simplicity that we'll find in the literature. So if you want to go deep, check that out. It's just called How to Think About God by Pat Flynn, not Mortimer Adler. There's two books with the same title. I also have an article on my blog called Safeguarding Divine Simplicity with Bernard Lonergan. So that's where I go back to one of the greatest philosophers and theologians of the past 100 years, Bernard Lonergan. And I show how he gets a lot of it right, and how a lot of the contemporary objections that we see to divine simplicity in the literature, Lonergan addressed and refuted those way back. So that's on my blog. It's called Safeguarding Divine Simplicity with Bernard Lonergan. And then I had a 2.5-hour podcast with another Catholic philosopher, Christopher Tomaszewski, called Defending the Doctrine of Divine Simplicity. And we just go deep into the weeds there.
Wow.
So thanks for the softball, my friend. That's that's deep into that's deep territory, but it's really important. It's a really important doctrine.
Awesome.
Okay. All right. My turn. Sorry. Let me boot my phone back up here. Okay. So this is another question that came in for me that I'm gonna if you follow my podcast, I'm gonna re-ask some of these questions to Gavin Kerr and Brian B. Song, but I want to throw it your way as well, Eric.
All right.
I know even theists and theist philosophers have mixed thoughts on so-called intelligent design. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So your thoughts on the intelligent design.
So I grew up pretty fundamentalist in a lot of ways, you could say. I grew up as a Baptist, and I say all that to just let people know that I did grow up with all sorts of arguments against evolution, against and for intelligent design as well. Which that you can believe in intelligent design and believe in evolution, but so those are two different things. But that's how I grew up, and I kind of go back to those things. So actually, in ninth grade biology class, Pat Flynn, I did a project on the irreducible complexity of the bacterial flagellum. And I was using Dr. Behe's work, who you've had on your podcast,
Yeah.
about
Actually, real quick, he's going to be on next week debating with Dr. Josh Swamidas, actually, this very subject. So this is a timely question.
Wow.
Mhm.
Yeah, so there's a motor in this bacteria, the flagellum, that basically it's like 22 parts to this thing, and without one of the parts, it would never function. And so all had to be there at one time, or else it would never exist, basically. And so we see things like that. Or we also have the example of the woodpecker, right? That has to have both types of saliva going at the same time. Like if it evolved from one to the other, it would never have existed because you need both simultaneously. Those are more, geared towards the evolution stuff. But it also shows like there's some sort of design that takes place in these animals or these molecules. And so to me, intelligent design, it just makes so much sense. Like when you drive past a house, you don't think like, wow, this is kind of a random thing. Like, I wonder how it got here. You think like there's probably a designer, there's probably an architect. And a house is not nearly as complicated as the human eye or the human body. And so when we look at things like that are more complicated than houses, why do we all of a sudden think like, well, there must not be a God and it must have just randomly come here? No, there has to be a certain design to it. And once again, like this doesn't necessarily say that evolution, like we couldn't evolve over time or that there's adaptation that takes place. But the fundamental level, when we look at the universe, we see a certain design. And so I think, you go to all the different factors, like what is there, like 21 different fine tuning points, that if one of those was dialed a different way, we wouldn't exist. And so to me, it seems like those are very helpful arguments. Those are very helpful things to point out, is that, yeah, when we look at the universe, we look at the stars, we look at our bodies and how complicated they are, it seems to point to some sort of design. And so I'm not sure if I'm covering your question exactly, but that's my response so far.
It sounds just kind of like a personal question, what you think of it. So I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer here.
I like it.
Yeah, I like it. It sounds good to me. Yeah. It's funny because when I first, was moving towards theism, it was the philosophical arguments that got me, right? I still think that those are the most decisive, especially for God and the human soul and the immateriality of our intellect specifically. But then, yeah, I just got curious and I started reading some of Dr. Michael Behe's work. And what immediately impressed me was how unfairly he was caricatured by his critics. Now, I am not a molecular biologist, but I know an ad hominem when I see it, right? I know when somebody is when bad arguments are being presented, even on areas of expertise or areas, subject matters where I have no relevant expertise. So that made me curious. And as you said, I've had him on the podcast before. I've chatted with him. And the thing that I try and tell people is, yeah, where's my position on this right now? I would say that criticisms of some people in the intelligent design movie towards the sort of neo-Darwinian, sort of worldview, should be taken a lot more seriously than they currently are. And I think Dr. Michael Behe is a good example of this, because he's very clear, right? He doesn't like, evolution is an accordion term, and that's what people need to understand. Like, to say that he has a criticism of evolution means for him a very specific thing. He doesn't challenge common descent, for example. He's saying, no, there seems to be a difficulty with the proposed mechanism of evolution, of selection and mutation, for some of the reasons that you gave, Eric. Like, we have these structures, even at the molecular level, that are irreducibly complex, in the sense that they don't seem to have functional intermediaries, right? It's like, it seems like everything needs to be there all at once, coordinated in order for it to serve any other purpose. So it's hard to see, given the proposed mechanism, how that would have ever evolved, right? Sorry, did you want to chime
Well,
in
I
there?
just had a joke: material simplicity instead of divine simplicity,
Yeah, there you go.
something like that.
So what would I say? I guess I would say, first off, certainly nobody's faith needs to depend on the arguments from the intelligent design theorists. If anything, I've just tried to be a friendly platform for some of the thinkers that I think are advancing important scientific arguments. And that's what Behe really insists on, that he's got no philosophy of nature. He's a serious scientist himself, and he's got serious empirical critiques. And he does, right? If you read his books, you'll see him really rolling up his sleeves, getting into the research and making his case. And so I think anybody who's got a scientific spirit needs to respect that, right? At
Yeah.
the end of the day, we want to know the truth about things. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. But I've tried to encourage some dialogue about that. And I'll tell you, I held a debate between him before. I think he did a fantastic job. Dr. Swamidas, who himself is a Christian, he's been somewhat critical of various aspects of intelligent design. So I say, come on the show, let you guys have at it. So that should be next week, and I would invite people to tune in and hear the arguments
Wow,
and see what you think. Mm-hmm.
that's great. Okay, well, do you have any more thoughts on that, or are we ready to move on to the next
Yeah, I just realized
question?
they said next week, but I don't know when this episode will air. So maybe
Well,
maybe it
for
was 2
yeah,
weeks ago or a month ago. I
it'll
don't know.
probably be 2 weeks
Yeah,
ago. Yeah,
yeah.
that's so funny. Um, okay, this is just kind of a fun question, I think. You've mentioned before on our episodes that you really got into near-death experiences, like researching them. I just wanted to know if you had any on the top of your head that you could just share with us, like any near-death experiences that you remember researching that were like, whoa, that was crazy.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to cite them, but I mean, like, you have the
The
Parnia study,
gist.
and stuff like that. So people should look into the peer-reviewed, studies on this. I think you might be surprised at what has actually come out in the literature. There was one case. Apologies if I get the details wrong. That just really surprised me. I almost am tempted to look it up as we talk here, but it was something like some woman had to be like put into a deep, like, frozen state for a severe, like, very, like, threatening brain surgery or something like that. And her eyes were sealed shut before the surgery and stuff like that. And of course, she goes, into the surgery, and there's just no way that she would have had been able to experience the things that she did, right? Of course, she had, like, the traditional, like, near-death experience, was able to report what was going on during the surgery. It was either, if it wasn't in this case, there's similar cases like it where she was able to talk about, like, certain instruments that were up on certain shelves that she would have never been able to see, stuff like that. And those little accounting of details are really important that can then be independently verified. So it was these what's called veridical experiences in the research, and the veridical experience are experiences that people have in these near-death experiences that are later verified by independent researchers. So if you hear the term veridical experience, that's what it means, right? And why is that important, and why did that strike me? So it was numerous things like this. So there's other ones where somebody's, they're dead, clinically dead, meaning fixed and dilated pupils, flat EEG, stuff like that. And they're having this out of body near death experience, and they can go through walls, and they can even go outside the hospital, and they find, like, a shoe on a ledge that looks a certain way that they definitely would not have been able to see. And then they can go back and they can report that and say, like, hey, there's a shoe out there and it looks like this. And people go out and they're like, by golly, they were right. Right. So it's a lot of, again, I'm messing up some of the details because it's been a while, but it was stuff like that that really struck me, the veridical experience. Now, why would that really strike me, and why should it strike other people? Well, two reasons. One, given that there's little to no brain activity of the people who experience this, it's amazing that they experience anything at all, right? If materialism were true, we would not expect something like that. However, people want to propose, well, this is just a projection of oxygen shortage to the brain. It's a hallucination. But here's the thing. Hallucinations don't produce veridical experiences, right? Sensorial knowledge that can then be later verified by independent researchers. So a hallucination itself would be pretty remarkable, but hallucinations don't produce veridical experiences, and that's the key.
Right.
So it was the veridical experiences that really caused me to eventually think, okay, I think that these are, if not decisive, right? Because we're in the realm of science here, which always deals with probabilities, at least a very strong weight in the scale of theism and afterlife, right? And if God exists and the human soul can survive bodily death, then think of it like this. Might we expect something like near-death experiences? Actually, yeah, that kind of makes sense, right? But if all humans are just some, haphazard assembly of chemical impulses, whichever way you want to get it, like, would we expect anything like near-death experiences? It's hard to see how, right? It really is hard to see how. So I would just say, if we're just comparing hypothetical worldviews, hypothesis, general theism, hypothesis, general materialism, the fact that we have this data and research on near-death experiences without even going too deep into the weeds, I think is a strong weight in the scale of theism, would be a way to think about it.
And what was the journal you recommended, or the articles?
Yeah, so who does a good job overviewing the research is Father Robert Spitzer. And so if you want like a good kind of synopsis of the actual peer-reviewed studies and arguments on interpretation, I would grab Father Robert Spitzer's The Soul's Upward Yearning is a good book where he goes through
Wow.
that. Mm-hmm.
All right.
For sure.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. No, it's fun. I haven't spent a lot of time with that recently, but that was a weight in the scale for me, for sure. Near-death experiences. Okay, jokey. All right, so let me ask you this then, Eric. I know you've written a lot on church unity. Why is it? What is it, and why is it important? I'll let you take it any direction that you want. What is church unity? Why is it important?
Well, I have a book coming out in November, which is basically my thesis that I wrote this summer, and it's going to be called Visible Unity, A Calling of Christ for the Church. So I specifically said visible unity. So you can kind of, say unity is two, it has an invisible dimension and a visible dimension. So when it comes to church unity, what we really mean invisibly is that we have the same faith, hope, and love. We share the same faith. We are charitable to one another. We're united in our bonds as brothers and sisters, right? And that transcends even the Catholic Church, right? That goes beyond the church's walls to our Protestant brothers and sisters, where we can have some sort of invisible unity, where we both recognize that we're brothers and sisters in Christ. And we have that bond there. And so that's really important. That's what the Second Vatican Council called the soul of the ecumenical movement, which ecumenical movement is to make the church one again. And so drawing all people back into full communion of the Catholic Church. And now that's where we're stepping into visible unity. So visible unity is not just those invisible dimensions, but it's also we're under the same governance. So the same hierarchy, and we're partaking of the same sacraments. So sacraments are basically visible means of invisible grace. So there's a visibility to it. And so visible unity, okay, we need to, like St. Ignatius of Antioch in 107 AD said, to have a church, you need to have a bishop and you need to have the Eucharist, and there is no Eucharist without the bishop. And so those two things alone, you could say that's very a key to understanding visible unity. So are we partaking of the same Eucharist under the same bishop? And obviously we don't have to be under the same bishop as far as the regions, but then we get into the Bishop of Rome. So union with the Bishop of Rome also comes into very big importance when it comes to visible unity, because there is one flock and one shepherd, and Jesus is the ultimate shepherd, right? But he has appointed Peter as his representative. And so to be in union with Peter is a classic delineation line between visible unity and invisible unity, or between unity and not unity, disunity. Now that we have a lot of even visible unity with our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters, but we don't have full visible unity because they're not in union with Peter. And so why is this important? Why is visible unity, not just invisible, important? This is a huge thing, because oftentimes in my conversations with my Protestant friends, it's like, hey, we both love Jesus. What's the big deal? You know, I don't understand this. Well, because it was a big deal to Jesus. He prayed in John 17 that we would be one, so that the world would know that the Father sent the Son for the salvation of the world. Like, so what's at stake with unity in general is evangelization, to reach the world. And the visible dimensions influence the invisible. So if we're not united in the same Eucharist under the same bishops, then that compromises our invisible dimensions as well. It can weaken those bonds of love between one another. And it's like, well, why aren't we part of the same church, experiencing the same Eucharist and all of that? And growing up as a Protestant, I didn't have the Eucharist. So I didn't have the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ given to me. Well, that's a problem. Like, I really wish I would have. And so visible unity actually gives us access to those invisible dimensions of grace, that if we still remain divided and we pretend that we have a unity, well, we do have some semblance of unity, but if we pretend we have more unity than we actually have, then we're cutting people off from Jesus Christ in the Eucharist, which is profoundly wrong and bad. And so Jesus, it's on his heart for unity. And the church has always understood unity in not just being this invisible bond between believers, but as a visible church. And it's important to be part of that visible church, just as ancient Israel was a visible body of people. So the new Israel, the church, is a visible body of people. And so that's what unity is and why it's so important. I could go on, and I'm going to do a lot of different podcasts coming up on my book that's coming out, that will go into the historical, theological, and evangelical implications of why this is so important. And, you know, I'm just so passionate about it because it's so misunderstood. Like, if we have different starting points as to what church even is, then that's a problem. We can look at moral issues. Okay. A lot of Protestants believe contraception is okay. Well, Catholic Church teaches that it's gravely immoral. Well, which is it? And what should we teach people when we're discipling them? Some people think the Eucharist is just a symbol. Others, like Catholics, believe it's actually Jesus. Well, that's a night and day difference between a piece of bread and the real presence of Christ. Okay, so that's a problem when we have these disunifying things, aspects of the faith. And surely that dwindles our witness and dwindles even our ability to love one another as brothers. And if we truly love one another, we want each of us to experience the fullness of truth. And there has to be, and I go into this in my book as well, as like, we're human beings. We're not angels, so we're not pure spirits. And we're not animals, so we're not pure material matter. We're human beings that have both invisible and visible. So our very person, we are visible and invisible. So we need a visible and invisible unity. This is what we see in marriages, right? We see that there's obviously a huge importance when spouses are invisibly unified. So they have this love for one another, this like communication that goes beyond material. But you also need to have intercourse. You need to have that sexual relation in the marital embrace to express that invisible love. And both go hand in hand. They're tied to one another. And that's important because we're visible and invisible. And that expands out to the church. So that's enough for now, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's great. So let me ask you the same thing you asked me with Divine Simplicity for people who want to go further and deeper until your book comes out, of course. Any resources off the top of your head that you'd recommend on that subject?
Look up Saint Cyprian of Carthage and his short letter really on Christian unity. It was written around 250 AD, and that'll blow your mind. And that's how the early church viewed unity. And it's very clear that if you're not in union with Peter, that's not good. And then I would also read St. Ignatius of Antioch's letters. I'm trying to think of which one exactly was the one that says basically like without the bishop, there is no church. And I think it's the letter to the Trallians. So I would read those two sources, and I would definitely read the Second Vatican Council's decree on ecumenism. So read that decree on ecumenism. All three of the things I just mentioned are very short, but they pack a punch. And so those are the three things that I would recommend reading. And then I recently did a podcast on evangelizing Protestants, ? That's actually gotten quite a bit of downloads. But I give 8 reasons why to evangelize Protestants, and all of that has to do with this topic of visible unity. I mean, so it's really going more into that as well.
Yeah, very cool. Good stuff, my man.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We've talked about this before, so I just want to know, what is your current thought toward predestination?
Yeah, with what, 4 minutes left on our podcast here?
Yeah.
Go down the predestination rabbit hole.
I can go on an easier question.
Yeah, no. This is good. Let me give a very brief response, and then we could maybe take this deeper in a future episode, because this definitely merits not just an episode, a series on its own. Let me say why I think the study of predestination is really important and fascinating and interesting. I love the study of predestination because you have to work really hard on a number of various subjects to even approach this question, right? You have to work really hard on scripture. You have to work really hard on metaphysics. You have to work really hard in philosophical anthropology. I think all these things bear heavily on the question of predestination. Of course, the nature of God, God's relationship to the world, God's eternity, human freedom, the nature of grace, what God reveals. Like, you just have to like try and juggle a million different things as you're wrestling with this, right? Which is why it is a notoriously difficult subject, and it's why I've always been attracted to it, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's also a pressing subject, right? Because you get certain objections like, hey, if God foreknows everything that I'm going to do, then why did he create me? Or do I really have free will? And you know, that rests on right there is a basic mistake, right? God isn't in time looking forward. God is eternal. All things are physically present to God in his eternity, right? So he knows things very much in an analogous way as I know that Eric is right there because I see him, right? But we also have to remember that God's knowledge is his power. So he knows things as causing them eternally. So I would argue the issue with when it comes to human freedom isn't as much with God's knowledge. At least it isn't as much as thinking of it in the perspective of knowledge, but thinking about it in the perspective of causality, right?
His
and the
will.
different causality and will, right? That's where it gets more interesting to me. And I think if you want the short answer of who I think got it right, or at least got the best or closest account, I'll give 3 thinkers where I would say if you read these 3 thinkers, you would converge pretty closely on where I'm landing on this right now. Jacques Maritain, 2 books from him would be Existence and the Existent and God and the Permission of Evil. So Jacques Maritain. Bernard Lonergan, who takes a different approach than Maritain, but they come, I would say, under the same general umbrella, Grace and Freedom. And Dr. Michael Torre, who I've had on my podcast. He's got a very good, thick book on this called Do Not Resist the Spirit's Call. And at the end of the day, I want to affirm that Catholics can hold God's universal causality, his sovereignty, and human freedom, and that we can defend and hold all these things, that God does not arbitrarily will that some are saved and some are damned, like Calvinism, that we really do enter into the drama in a real way, but also that we cannot frustrate God's universal will either, right? So there's a million different things to unpack on this question, and it's a wonderful, fascinating study, but I would say, yeah, I'm probably closest to Jacques Maritain. I think he got it right. I think he strikes the right balance between, say, like the harder Thomists who are in my mind borderline Calvinist, and also Molinism, which I think is false. So yeah, there's like Neo-Bayesianism, and then there's Molinism. I'm with Maritain and Francisco Maransola and Dr. Michael Tor in that camp. So I know that that's just kind of a punting answer, but it's the best I can do in 4 minutes.
No, I like it. I wanted to know where you were at because, when we were talking to Carlo earlier this summer, it seemed like you were more leaning towards the more hardcore Thomist approach, I guess.
No, I was pushing back on that. That's where Carlo.
Oh yeah, you were.
And
yeah,
we've had fascinating exchanges, really good back and forth. And I've presented dilemmas for the harder Thomists and the Neo-Bayesians. And I want to say that they're in a position. This won't make sense to people who aren't familiar with the debate, but I want to say that they're in a tough spot in the sense that they're either going to impugn at least our intuitions of God's goodness, unless they also accept universalism, which most of them don't, right? But because it's going to be borderline Calvinistic, or they're going to have to make certain concessions, which will essentially drive them to Maritain's view or something very much like it either way.
Wow.
Yeah, so
Well,
I obviously didn't substantiate that. That's just an assertion at this point.
More to
but
come.
More to come. Yeah,
that's great. I tried looking up Maritain's book, but I didn't find it. But hopefully, I'll find it this time.
Yeah, so you can find existence and the existence and the existent pretty easily. But his one where he goes much more into detail, which I think is a beautiful and fantastic book and a must read on this subject, is God and the Permission of Evil. That one is hard to find. You gotta kind of really dig around to find a copy of that. But if you're interested in this subject, you need to find a copy of it.
Wow. Well, Pat, I don't know how you became this smart and how you have time to read all these things with all your kids and everything, but I'm thankful that you do.
You see the bags under my eyes, my friend.
Oh yeah, you don't sleep. Oh, perfect.
That's right. Yeah. Wow. No, I appreciate it. They're big subjects. They're important subjects, right? So. Yeah, that'll be fun. We'll discuss it more in a future episode. But this has been fun. I love these. I love these back. Well, by the way, for people who are listening, we don't tell each other the questions beforehand. We come in totally blind on this, so we never know what we're gonna get.
Yes. Well, I think we're off the hot seat now. That's enough. That was 6 questions, 3 each. So yeah, please everyone leave a review on our podcast if you like it. If you don't, then just remain silent. No, just kidding. Yeah, please leave a review if you like it, and we'll catch you next time. Peace.